our speaker tonight, we're very lucky to have Doug Robinson, Chief Conservation Officer for Trust for Nature. Doug has a wealth of experience that hopefully he will fill us in about a little bit about his background, perhaps, because I don't have a bio. I don't actually know, but I do know that Doug is, yes, incredibly knowledgeable about how grasslands have fared over decades, and I'm very much looking forward to what he has to tell us. He's crunched the numbers. He's got down into the statistical weeds, perhaps. Well, hopefully we won't be getting error bars, but who knows? We will see how things go, and it should be very, very interesting talk. So, Doug, please, over to you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you for the invitation to Grassy Plains Network. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country I'm on this evening, which is La Trobe University's Shepparton campus. So I pay my respects to the Yorta Yorta and Bangarang nations and their elders past, present and emerging. I will also just give a little shout out to La Trobe University, who supports me as an honorary fellow and gives me this little facility to beam in from tonight. So I'll just share a presentation. Hopefully that's come up. Yep. So this evening, as Adrian said, I'm Chief Conservation Scientist with Trust for Nature, and I'm approaching my quarter of a century with the Trust, and thought it would be useful to give a sort of long-term retrospective look at how we've progressed with grassland conservation in Victoria, and then think about sort of how far we've got to go and how to get there.
Doug, before you proceed, we can see your slides down the side if you want to actually go the full screen experience.
Oh, okay. I thought I'd done that. Okay. So at my end, let me just see. That might be a technological thing, Adrian.
Yep, fair enough. We will survive. Oh, hold on, let's see what that does.
So is that changed?
No, it hasn't. So, all right, let's not worry about
it. So you can still see a large image?
You can see the large image and just the next slide, or your list of slides down the left-hand side. You can probably minimize that column down the side, and that might just help.
Oh, can I do that?
I don't know.
Try. Yeah.
Oops. What can you see now?
Just the same.
Oh.
Well, let's not worry.
All right.
Peter says you need to click on the little square box at the bottom right of the screen, but you've done that, and that didn't make any difference. So, yeah. Sorry for interrupting.
No, not at all, and I apologise for that. As I say, it looks fine as a screenshot at my end. So I'll talk a little bit about Trust for Nature for those of you who don't know about our organisation, and then starting at the biggest scale in terms of ecosystem protection trends over time and drilling down towards grasslands, and then the importance of private land for grassland conservation, Trust for Nature's role in that space, and then getting to the nitty-gritty around the current shortfall in grassland protection, the ongoing loss of grasslands, and the ways forward. So Trust for Nature is a funny beast. We were established in 1972 during the Hamer government under the Victorian Conservation Trust Act. And there's some wonderful minutes from the very first meeting in April 1973, which Premier Hamer attends briefly and sort of declares that the purpose of a trust is to acquire land that should never have been used for other purposes and should now be made available for conservation for the people of Victoria. And the Minister for Conservation, Mr. Borthwick, follows that up by sort of saying they hope to rectify the mistakes of the past and again sort of protect important habitat for Victorians. So we were sort of very lucky. We evolved in a very progressive era when a whole lot of conservation reforms came through. But in addition to that statutory function, we are also a not-for-profit trust and able to receive gifts of money and land, and in a way was set up to enable gifts of land to the Government of Victoria. And so over our close to 50-year history now, we have received sort of more than 50 transfers of property, many of them gifts that subsequently went back to the Crown Estate. So places like Sea Winds, which is part of Mornington Peninsula National Park, Churchill Island, parts of Greens Bush, and so on. We've been very lucky that our Act has stayed the same, so our statutory objectives are written in 1970s style. They're very broad and just enable us to protect flora and fauna and significant areas of habitat for native plants and wildlife. But really, since we were formed, our focus has been on private land conservation and on permanent protection of habitats on private land. And most of our conservation covenants and our own reserves form part of the National Reserve System. So the ways in which we protect land, the best known is obviously conservation covenants, which are voluntary agreements entered into with landholders who want to protect part or all of their property in perpetuity. So the conservation covenant is the statutory agreement that sort of sets that in place. But we also have done many direct land purchases and currently own approximately 40 reserves across Victoria. We've brokered acquisitions on behalf of the Victorian government. We have a revolving fund whereby we buy land that has conservation value. We then sell it on with a conservation covenant attached at the point of sale. As I mentioned, we can receive gifts of land. And then we provide a security mechanism for various programs, so partly for the offset world and also for the Victorian government's restoration program, Bushbank.
Excuse me,
and finally,
Doug.
we act as a
Doug.
trustee.
Sorry, Doug, to interrupt again. Your slides aren't changing.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, yeah, we're still on topics covered.
Okay. Maybe chat among yourselves for a minute,
Yes.
hey, and I'll just
I
sort
think
it out.
that's a good idea. Indeed. Okay, let's see what's going on. Oh, that changed just then. That worked, whatever you did. Where I can see permanent protection summary now.
Okay.
And now I can see land protection options.
But you can still see them down the side.
Yes. But hey, that's the...
I think if you, at the top where it says slideshow, if you click on that, it'll actually run it as a slideshow. At the moment, it's in drafting. Yeah, just on the left there, click from beginning, and then you'll be able to click through them.
Oh, thank you.
No worries.
That's brilliant. A huge debt to whomever that was.
Yes, the hive mind, that's what it was. It's Alexandra, I believe, but I may be wrong.
So can you now see land protection options?
Yes.
Beautiful. And the only other function I wanted to touch on is our capacity to act as a trustee for dedicated campaigns. So we have done this as the trustee for several offset funds, of which the most famous is the Spiny Rice Flower Conservation Trust Fund, which many of you are familiar with. And we've also managed a growling Grass Frog Trust Fund within the Merry Creek catchment, which we've now wound up with that catchment committee, and a Golden Sun Moth Conservation Fund. But we've also acted as the fundraising manager for campaigns, for example, to purchase Mount Elephant back as a public space. So over our 45 years, we've now entered into 1,700 conservation covenant agreements protecting nearly 80,000 hectares of private land in perpetuity.
Sorry, Doug. Are the slides supposed to have, are we still on land protection options or have we moved on?
Oh, no. Yeah,
there we go. Okay. So you might have to just click in that left-hand column to get them. Yes, clicking in the left-hand column moves them about. Yeah. So I think.
And what can you see?
So I can see permanent protection summary now.
Yep.
Yep. All right. Let's go with that method.
Sorry about this.
No, it's okay. It's inevitable. Every talk, one of these glitches. Not every talk, but I'd say 40% of them we have some inexplicable glitch. I think we'll move to Teams or something. Anyway, please excuse me. Carry on, Doug.
So yeah, so this slide really talks to itself, really just summarising the permanent protection we've achieved over the last 45 years, either directly or through enabling, for example, the acquisition of conservation land by the Conservation Agency. So we'll try our luck. So can you now see the slide on grassy ecosystem protection trends? Oops.
Perfect, Doug. Yes.
So I'll just talk about some analyses we've been doing recently, and we've used as a baseline the Collaborative Australian Protected Area Database. Has Excel spreadsheets of protected areas by jurisdiction and spatial layers accompanying them, going back to 1997. So we've just done a series of analyses from 1997 up until the most recent data set in 2022. But have also been analysing the Victorian Environment Assessment Council's statewide assessment of public land data set. So they, for every ecological vegetation class in Victoria, they estimated the extent by different land tenures and also the extent that was in protected areas on public land. So, has that slide changed for you, showing the hectare change in EVC group protection?
I'm sorry, it hasn't, Doug.
That's all right.
Oh, no, it has. Yep. Just
yeah, I'll just do it this cumbersome way for now.
Yes, yes. Be cumbersome.
So this is a 10-year blind analysis of the change in protected areas by EVC group, of which has 20, between 1997 and 2022. So we can see that, you know, there's been a huge increase in the extent of mallee protected areas, primarily due to the establishment of the Murray Sunset National Park, and then dry forests and wet forests. And if you come along and can see my cursor, we can see that the extent of plains, grasslands and canopod shrublands hasn't sort of increased dramatically compared to those. But if we actually look at the percentage change in EVC group protection over that time, then you can actually see that plains grasslands and canopod shrublands have had this really significant increase in the relative extent protected compared to how much was protected back in 1997. And I'll drill more into that detail as we go. I quite like this slide because it kind of does show the consequences of a series of public land use investigations by the Land Conservation Council and its successors, the Environment Conservation Council and VX. So we can see that as a result of the box ironbark investigation, box ironbark forests have done this big shift with a more than 60% increase in protected area compared to 1997. Then the red gum investigation led to the riverine grassy woodlands having a really big increase. And EVC groups like rainforests basically came out of Melbourne too. So the message really out of this slide is that, relatively speaking, plains grasslands and canopod shrublands have been a real focus, and we've seen proportionally a large increase in their protected extent over that time. Looking now at just Trust for Nature's contribution, and the vertical axis here, as you can see, the maximum is 45,000 hectares. So again, with Trust for Nature, the largest change in hectares has been in the extent of protected plains grasslands and canopod shrublands over this period. And this is primarily due to the purchase of Ned's Corner Station back in 2003, but also the purchase of some of the other reserves on the Northern Plains, particularly Wanderers Plains on the lower Avoca. And again, we've had significant increases in the hectares protected of plains, woodlands and forests, partly due again to Ned's Corner and Wanderers Plain, but also part of a sort of really tight focus on woodlands conservation. So again, if we now look, and this is a slide that's looking at the proportional change in Trust for Nature's contribution towards overall EVC group protection in Victoria. So we're sort of saying where has the Trust through its private land protection efforts had real impact? And what this is saying is that of all of the protected areas across all tenures that comprise plains grasslands and canopod shrublands, the Trust is contributing more than 50% of that protected extent. And indeed, with woodlands, we're contributing approximately 10%. So you can see this real role for the Trust and its focus on private land, which all makes sense in the context of where grasslands are located tenure-wise. So I just wanted to give you, again, a sort of overall summary of changes for the main grassy ecosystem groups over this period from 1997 to 2022. So in olive, we're looking at how much was protected on public land back in 1997, and there's basically minuscule amounts protected on Trust for Nature land at this stage, so I haven't worried too much about trying to tease out that detail. And so you can see that there wasn't much herb-rich woodland protected, wasn't much plains grassland, canopod shrubland protected. And then in bright green, it's showing the additional extent that's been protected on Crown land in that intervening period. And then in the yellow-orange is showing the contribution of Trust for Nature up to 2022. So I suppose what stands out for me is particularly the plains grassland, canopod shrubland EVC group. We can see real change over this close to 30-year period in terms of additional protection, with a significant proportion coming, as I said, from Trust for Nature. And as I touched on earlier, we can see that with the riverine grassy woodlands, as a result of a red gum investigation, a really large increase in that protected area extent. And then just finally drilling right down, these are the changes in the protection of the plains grassland ecological vegetation class from 1997 to now. So again, in olive, we can see the extent of protected habitat on Crown land back in 1997. In bright green is showing the additional areas that have been protected on Crown land subsequent to that, with these really major increases in the Riverina and indeed in the Victorian volcanic plains, and then in the yellow-orange, the contributions by Trust for Nature. So huge gains, particularly in those two bioregions, and I'll come to that in more detail. Hopefully this is working with this slightly cumbersome way of dipping in and out. So moving to the importance of private land for lowland grassland conservation, and I'm not telling any of you facts that I'm sure you don't know already, but it's just useful to summarise again for context that grasslands, as in plains grasslands, historically occupied more than 1 million hectares of Victoria, or approximately 5% of the total area. They are recorded through EVC modelling as having occurred in 14 out of 29 bioregions, but only 13% of their pre-European extent remains, about 169,000 hectares, and less than 5% of that remaining extent is formally protected. Oops. So this is a summary of, of all of the bioregions where plains grassland historically occurred. I'm not expecting you to take in all of the detail, but just in this column called the total remaining percent, we can see the percentage amount ranges from 34% on the northern inland slopes, but for the major grassland bioregions, the volcanic plains is approximately 14% of their former extent, with 88% of that on private land. And the Victorian Riverina, 16% remains, 82% on private land, and so forth. What I also just wanted to touch on again as a reminder to all of us, and this is an old graph from the first statewide conservation plan we published back in 2013, and it was just showing the relative importance of broad habitat types for threatened flora and fauna that we'd identified as priorities on private land. So grasslands, as you can see, they have the highest proportion of threatened flora species and a relatively high proportion of threatened fauna species. I guess what is salient is that since we did this work, and indeed since we published our 2021 to 2030 statewide conservation plan, grassland animals such as fat-tailed dunnart and blue-winged parrot have now become listed as threatened species, either in Victoria as for the dunnart, or indeed nationally threatened as for the blue-winged parrot. And it's pertinent to remember that, you know, there's approximately 60 other fauna species which have more than, or non-threatened species currently, but they have more than 70% of their habitat modelled as being on private land. And they include grasslands-dependent species like white-fronted chat, which is now listed as threatened in New South Wales, and curl snake, which really depends on relatively high quality, heavy soil grasslands. So I think the message again is grasslands are critical for many animals already threatened, but we're continuing to watch the progression of species that have been common in our lifetimes becoming threatened now, and we really need to pay attention to the health of sort of all of these animals and plants that are still relatively abundant and widespread. So coming to Trust for Nature's program, the way in which we've now worked for many years is the identification of priority landscapes or priority sites, landholder engagement, and then a focus on site protection and ongoing management and site-specific actions as required. And I'll focus tonight on site protection and just briefly touch on some of the other topics within this. So in terms of site identification at the highest scale, Trust for Nature's statewide conservation plan has identified a set of focal landscapes across Victoria, which are the landscapes that we think provide the best opportunities to maintain the health of ecosystems and viable populations of animals and plants. So we developed a set of principles and rules around how to define them, and the map here shows where they're distributed across Victoria. And so in terms of grasslands, we have the Western Riverina, west of Echuca up to close to Swan Hill.
We're not seeing the map, Doug.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Got
There
you.
we go.
Sorry, I forgot to do the...
Cumbersome. Yes.
Yep. So the Western Riverina up here, the Eastern Riverina landscape, which is mostly woodlands, but includes small pockets of native grasslands. And down in the volcanic plains, we do have little fragments of volcanic plains within our focal landscapes, mostly around some of the Stony Rise landscapes. So drilling into the Western Riverina focal landscape, so the map on the left shows the full extent of that. And then this is the lower Avoca priority patch within that landscape. And this is a map just beginning to show the actual prioritisation at the property parcel scale. And I'll talk about this more later on in the talk, but it's just to give you, I guess, a sense of the kind of planning we've been trying to do at the statewide and the local scale. In terms of landholder engagement, and it's very good to see Morrow in the audience here tonight, who's been sort of integrally involved with a lot of the Northern Plains Conservation Management Network program and just direct landholder engagement and management up there. Thanks, Peter. But I guess over the years, we have done a whole range of things. So back in the mid-90s, we commissioned a whole lot of vegetation surveys of landscapes identified as priorities for grassland and grassy woodland protection. Tim Barlow, way back in the late 90s, put together the Grassy Guidelines document about management of grassy ecosystems. And then us teams have done a whole lot of work around plains wanderers in particular. And so this is a farm shed that, as you can see, has been painted with plains wanderers and some of the threatened plants of the Northern Plains. And it's visible from the Murray Valley Highway and has a small parking bay where you can pull in and read about the species and the conservation program. So it's sort of all critical, as we know, in terms of engaging with landholders and the community and bringing about conservation outcomes. So just a quick summary of, I guess, what I think of as the Trust's major grassland protection achievements over time. So in 1997, we enabled the purchase of more than 1,200 hectares of grassland on the Northern Plains adjacent to Terek National Park. So this is a set of paddocks known as the Davies paddocks, and they were purchased with funds from both the Victorian government and the Australian government, and a huge amount of credit to Paul Foreman, who did a lot of the negotiations for that whole purchase, and then the subsequent transfer back to the Crown. Then in 1998, we purchased a small grassland and woodland reserve in the eastern Northern Plains. In 2001, we purchased 3 more reserves, all of this with National Reserve System funding and philanthropic support. 2003, the big Ned's Corner station purchase, also with NRS support. And then in 2009, 2010 and 12, we either directly purchased or facilitated the purchase of multiple properties on the Lower Avoca, and I'll show you some examples of that shortly. And then across all of this time period, working with individual landholders, we've now established more than 35 protected areas on the Northern Plains, most of those through covenants. And similarly on the volcanic plains, we now have about 70 protected areas, again, mostly through covenants, contributing to the overall grassland protected estate. So I'm just going to show you a series of slides. I'm just thinking, let's see if it works from the current slide. So we're looking at the Lower Avoca Plain, and this has been a focus for Trust for Nature's work. And you're looking at an area of approximately 75,000 hectares, and these were the grassland reserves prior to 2005. So Trust for Nature had this Corrick Reserve, and DSE had purchased this reserve back in about 2003. Now, just tell me if this has come through.
No, it's still just 3 yellow squares highlighted.
Yep. All right. Look, I might just do this then in this format and just show you the sequence. So this was a purchase by DSE with National Reserve System funds of nearly 2,000 hectares in 2009. Then Trust for Nature acquired Wanderers Plain in 2010. And then we added another chunk to that. Actually that was in 2012, I think. Then some revolving fund purchases got added on to the larger estate. And so at 2017, we built the protected area system across all tenures to look like this. And the parcels in green show the parcels identified for our focal landscape mapping as being parcels we wanted to protect. And then in 2020, through support from DELP, we were able to protect these 2 linking parcels and add another 330 hectares to the conservation estate. So this is what it looks like currently. And as you can see, it's sort of quite a significant change from what it was back in pre-2005. And then similarly, this is the changes that have occurred on the Patho Plains from 1997 to currently. So back in 1997, we had Terek State Park, which is predominantly cypress pine woodland. And then we had some red gum reserves along the Murray, but very little else. And you can see in the map on the right, the subsequent additions through purchase. This is the Davies block that was added onto the Terek State Park, and then multiple purchases by the Conservation Department ever since then, and Trust for Nature's purchase of Glassland's grassland. So it's really changed the landscape, particularly in terms of the scale of grassland protection that we've all collectively achieved. But despite all of that progress, when we look at the current extent remaining of plains grassland as an ecological vegetation class, and the extent here is shown across the different bioregions, there's very little protected. So although we've got 170,000 hectares modelled of plains grassland remaining, we've got less than 7,000 hectares remaining in total. And what this graph shows in red is the estimated shortfall to achieve the National Reserve System standards for protection using what are called the Janus criteria, which is an awful acronym which came from the National Forest Policy Statement back in 1996, but essentially recommended that for endangered ecological vegetation types, one should protect 100% of their remaining extent. So that, I mean, that's a huge target if you use that one. If we use the Convention on Biological Diversity's more recent target of trying to get 30% protected of existing ecosystems by 2030, this sort of terrible pinkish bar colour is showing you how much we'd need to protect to get to that target. And it's still a formidable target. It's an additional 49,000 hectares compared to what we've achieved to date. So we know that we've got massive shortfalls in the extent of grassland protected for the reasons we all understand, that it's predominantly on freehold land, so we can't just bring about 10-year change. And of course, what's more problematic is that there is still loss. So in this map, in the green and the red is showing the gains we've made in conservation of grasslands on the northern plains, or the Patho plains, I should say. So Echuca's over here. But these hatched parcels are all native grasslands that have been lost in the last 20 years approximately. And this is just a rough estimate by some of our staff to give a sense of the scale of loss, happening at the same time that we're making gains in other ways. But during this period, a really important report done, or survey done by David Baker-Gabb and Rick Webster, back in 1993, identified 23 priority paddocks to protect for plains wanderer conservation, and 12 of those have subsequently been lost to cultivation. Luckily, 8 of those have been permanently protected, including this really important group of Davies paddocks. But our staff and other people working on the Northern Plains are estimating that we're probably losing still 500 to 1,000 hectares of grassland per annum. And when you look, for example, at other estimates of loss, we know it is still at a huge scale across Victoria. So some of you might be familiar with DSE's Land Cover Time series data set that's available on the website, and it comes out with summary tables of changes in land cover by bioregion or by catchment or by local government area. And then you can also download the spatial layers. But this is just one of the data sets showing the changes in what they assessed as being native ground cover between 1985 and 2020. So predominantly, as you can see, across most bioregions, we've had substantial declines in the extent of native ground cover, which probably doesn't surprise any of us, but it's just sort of testimony to this sort of quite rapid transformation of Victoria's lowlands. So, moving forward, I guess, what can we do to improve the protection of grasslands? Fundamentally, and this is, I should say, probably my view, perhaps as a scientist, rather than the trusts necessarily. But fundamentally, we need to halt the loss. We really need to develop stronger controls around native vegetation protection, controls relating to some of the grey areas in the current legislation around changes in land use and what is defined as being native vegetation. I think many of us would agree that we need stronger and more effective enforcement, and watching the federal government recently announced the establishment of a federal environmental compliance agency. I think it would be really worthwhile Victoria and other jurisdictions thinking about that as well, because I really think that the management of native vegetation requires a sort of dedicated focus in that way. I'll draw your attention to a series of policy papers that the Australian Land Conservation Alliance has put out recently ahead of the 30 by 30 strategy being developed by the Australian government. So one just talks about the conservation opportunities in general, and one is specifically around private land conservation opportunities. But they include the re-establishment of a dedicated land acquisition program, continuing investment in Indigenous protected areas, funding for covenanting, and I've added in Crown land tenure changes, noting that according to the VAC data, there's about 18,000 hectares of plains grassland on Crown land, which isn't in protected areas. So that would sort of seem a useful opportunity to explore and sort of see are those grasslands that we should transfer into the Crown Conservation Estate. And finally, many of us have fought and talked about for many years the idea of the establishment of a dedicated grassland trust fund. So I just thought I would quickly show you what the land acquisition program did achieve for nature conservation when it existed in Victoria. So the National Reserve System program back in 1996 set up a funding program to support the acquisition of reserves, and Victoria matched that, and so it also began contributing. So what we can see from this period is a steady growth, through the Crown acquiring 14 reserves in this time period from 1997, basically until 2012, which was when the National Reserve System program's funding program wound up, and DSE also sort of stopped its program. But that really led to, as you can see, to the addition of more than 6,000 hectares of plains grasslands, or grassy ecosystems, I should say, just on the Northern Plains. Similarly, for Trust for Nature on the Northern Plains, the National Reserve System, matched by donor funding, enabled us to acquire multiple reserves. And so again, over this period, we've built up a reserve estate of 3,500 hectares. So it's a really critical mechanism, especially with land prices now so high, so that incentives are also high. It just provides one of the ways forward. I won't dwell on management. I just will emphasise, as we all know, that protection is one step along the pathway to conservation for grassy ecosystems, but management is also critical. And so we need to think about how to sustainably fund that management going forward, because as we all know, grassy ecosystems go backwards very rapidly without that. And that is it. Thank you very much for your time.
Fabulous. Thank you, Doug. That was, yes, incredibly informative and lots of food for thought. I think I for one, am going to have to go back through those slides one at a time to try and get to really understand a lot of what was there in the background. It is, yes, well, people can put questions in the chat if they like, or if they want to just shout out. If anyone has a question we want to start with, then please let rip. No, okay. Well, let me, Doug, I suppose one of the things I found, I suppose a bit contrary to the typical narrative, is that like 13% of our grasslands remain, and that there's 169,000 or whatever hectares of it out there. There's, and you did say that it's modelled, and it does go across not only the Victorian volcanic plain, but all bioregions. Can you just talk a little bit about how that matches up with, the narrative that I put forward of like 1% remaining and so on?
So I think the figures are probably better than 1%, but I think 1% is a reasonable figure for high value grasslands.
Okay. And all right, that's interesting. That's good to know. And that's come, all right. And how do you go about identifying the high value grasslands that you want to purchase of? Is that mostly local knowledge, or are you using like satellite kind of information, or yeah, what's the process there?
Look, I guess local knowledge, but I mean, there have been a lot of systematic surveys over decades now that have identified, as I say, really important paddocks for plains wanderer conservation. A lot of people have been working in this space, so I do feel like most paddocks are probably known. It's just the opportunities, or options, I should say, to protect them that is the stumbling block.
Okay.
I mean, I did touch a little bit on, incentives now being problematic because of land prices. So, in parts of the southwest on the volcanic plains, land is now going for up to $20,000 a hectare. If you think of the sort of opportunity loss for what's reasonable for an incentive, you might be looking at 40 or 50% of the actual land value price. So that becomes a lot of money very quickly.
Certainly does. We've seen programs like the Melbourne Strategic Assessment, of course, which just like the billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, but that's funded through developer contributions, not through, so it's sort of revenue neutral. It's not the same system. We have one question from Peter McGrath here in the chat. Does this mean that grasslands protection is waning? Is the government doing enough? Is Trust for Nature a better answer?
Thanks, Peter. Well, they feel like Dorothy Dix's. I would say that grasslands protection is waning. Obviously, the Victorian government has and is investing heavily in the Western Grasslands Reserve, but that I think many of us know is quite problematic, having seen the sort of VAGO review of that process. And as I mentioned, Peter, the Victorian government stopped its land acquisition program back in 2012 when the National Reserve System program did as well. We've continued to lobby since then, I guess, for them to reinstate that, because it seemed a very cost-effective means of acquiring land and provided an opportunity to acquire land at speed when people flagged real concerns. So I don't have an answer beyond that. I mean, unfortunately, we probably need to look outside of government, I think, now for grassland protection options, but we need to really put concerted pressure on government to enforce the native vegetation protection laws and strengthen them.
Yes, amazingly concerning, that conversion of grassland to cropping that's occurring there, and that's prior land use rights is the grey area that you were talking about, isn't it? So people who somehow have a right to do whatever they like with their land, even if it is EPBC listed plains wanderer habitat kind of stuff. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I would really like to see us being stronger and more strategic in terms of planning. I mean, maybe we need to think about putting overlays on properties that have mapped grassland or mapped EPBC listed communities. Maybe it needs to be included in Section 32 vendor statements to say you actually have native vegetation. I don't know the answer. I just think we need to be much more progressive in the ways we think about this planning framework.
I think that's very right, and it seems to me a shame that there's seems to be a bit of a lack of environmental planners in the world. There seem to be a lot more planners on the other side, as it were, working to just develop stuff, and not much in the planning system to looking for environmental reform. We have Kath Rawlings has a question here. What management strategies does Trust for Nature put in place when a property is covenanted?
Yeah, thanks, Kath. So with every covenant, I guess we develop a management plan with the landholders, and I guess the management actions depend on what are the conservation values on the property and, you know, what are the threats. But with grasslands, I guess, as I touched on, we're aware that they need management. So many of our grassland covenants, we still allow grazing by stock. We're just trying to prevent cultivation.
And you'd have limits on the stocking rates and
Correct.
so on?
And the timing, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Is there something you wanted to add, Kath? Oh, you're on mute, but you know that. There you go.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I last November I did a little trip up to Terek and had a look at the Davies block, and I see that there are sheep running on part of that property, which is a management strategy. So that goes to your question, Adrian, about stocking rates and set stocking rates and rotational grazing. And I had another little question there, which brings me to, is education the key to bringing landholders on board? Because the farmers obviously have got to make a living and they're pushing against climate change. So I can understand from some perspective that it's difficult for them, but we also need to protect what we're losing. So it's a bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, but I mean, I really agree, Kath, education is critical. But and it felt like we were in a good space for quite a few years where most farmers on the Northern Plains were just grazing, and the really quite rapid conversion to cropping because of the prices available now for cropping produce has really changed some of those dynamics, I think.
Yeah.
So right, so it's not a matter of like meat prices have gone down. It's a matter that non-meat prices have gone up.
Yes.
Yes, right. Oh, that's interesting. Christine Wallace has a question. Can we talk about developer contributions and strategic planning a little more? How much input is achievable at the precinct structure planning stage to better protect remnant grasslands?
Well, it sounds like a great question for you, Adrian.
It does, doesn't it? It's I wish I knew the answer to that. Our experience of the Victorian Planning Authority has been, I suppose, not the best. We do try, and when there's a PSP opening up, we try and have a conversation with them saying, look, this should be connected to that, and you shouldn't do this, and so on. But it's obvious that there are good intentions amongst in the conversation, but at the same time, the planning system is still there to promote development rather than environmental protection, and the private land, the right to do what you like with your private land does seem to trump stuff. So I think it might be a mindset thing a little bit. I think they can probably turn around. I don't know. I'm sure there are people here who've had greater experience of the planning system than I have, but that's just been my experience. Are you a planner yourself, Christine?
Hi, Adrian. We've met before. I'm Kirstine Wallace from Wyndham City Council
Kirstine,
in the Urban Growth Subdivisions Department.
Yes.
So very familiar with the rapid rate of our beautiful paddocks, disappearing with asphalt and concrete in the vastest quantities in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment. I'm particularly working in these growth zones of grasslands, and it breaks my heart. I've First Nations heritage and lecturer at Uni of Melbourne, and there's a bigger picture where there's a piece in the puzzle that's not getting through, and by the time it gets to me, some of these conservation areas have been watered down and watered down and watered down, as we know. But there's an education of priority need that needs to come through to the strategic planning areas of various councils in the growth zones to educate, to promote, to seek the logic in their understanding of what we're about, what we're destroying, what is being lost. And as a huge carbohydrate source, brilliant bush foods and ecological systems that are intrinsic to these places, it's not too hard to spell out the logic of protecting our endemic grasslands more with more vigor than what is currently being attempted. Done.
Someone was recently telling me about research in Hungary on their grasslands, where they've got huge national parks that are grassland national parks, and they're working national parks. So they actually have grazing on them and dairy farming on them and all sorts of stuff happening, and they just set limits on the amount of usage, and that maintains them. I suppose Hungary is a bit different to Australia, but it's nevertheless.
Australia has even more reason to make First Nations led businesses, to support, to refine some of these skills and produce, and there's a lot that could be done with partnerships with our conservation heroes and our First Nations traditional owners to get economic flow and development.
That's right. I think that Ned's Corner would be a good example of that, wouldn't it? There's a big engagement with the First Nations people up in that corner of the state. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we're in the process of transferring the reserve back to First People of Miller-Wamali Aboriginal Corporation.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Peter McGrath has another question here. Is there a trend towards rewilding? Should we be requiring landholders to keep a portion of their land wild? And the Tim Entwistle from the Botanic Gardens was a big advocate of that.
So it's a great question, Peter, and I had the good fortune to go over to Europe more than a decade ago on a fellowship and look at their environmental programs. So in Europe and countries like the UK were part of the European Union then, farmers received a payment for being farmers, but they had to exchange that for some environmental commitments. And then in addition, each of the member states offered, substantial incentives that were equivalent to the amount they could get from farming practices to do conservation work. So I'm sure many of you have heard about the various environmental stewardship programs. We don't have such a system available in Australia. I think it's still one of those opportunities worth exploring in terms of keeping farmers on the land, but recognising that they could do other activities that we think of as a public good, and we as taxpayers support them. But I guess economists much smarter than me just sort of say we don't actually have the population base and funding base to enable that. But yeah, it's a really interesting idea.
Very interesting. Okay. I think one of the things that struck me about your talk tonight was just that it's easy enough to concentrate on the bad things, but that there is like such a big positive gain in the amount of, like I suppose we were starting from a very low bar, so it's quite easy to have quite a large percentage gain, but it is remarkable to see that so much more grassland is conserved now than what it was.
Absolutely. No, we should never lose sight of that. The counterfactual is always how much more might we not have today if we hadn't acted. Yes.
Okay, we'll keep that counterfactual. Does anybody have any more questions? I'm aware that we're going well past our hour's chat. Not that matters, but are there more questions that people would like to ask? No, all good. Well, we might let Doug then have the rest of his night off, I guess. I'd like to say thank you very, very much, Doug. That's been really informative, and it'll be great to look through the recording again, and perhaps you could share your slideshow with us if that's possible, and that because that'll make easier viewing than watching the entire presentation. That would be brilliant. Thank you very much. And there was some interesting references that you mentioned too that we'll be following up on as well.
Terrific.
So, thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you for the chance. See you all.
See you.